Lady Margaret Windsor had always been fascinated by the intricate dance of royal dining etiquette, but she never imagined how deeply these silent signals would cut into her heart until she found herself seated at the grand mahogany table of Buckingham Palace for the first time as an official member of the family. The massive dining room stretched before her like a golden cathedral, its crystal chandeliers casting warm light across portraits of monarchs long past. 24 chairs surrounded the table, each positioned with mathematical precision, each representing a story, a status, a secret that only those born into this world truly understood. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her pearl necklace, a nervous habit she'd developed since her engagement to Prince Edward 6 months earlier. She had studied the protocols, memorized the rules, and practiced the posture until her back ached, but nothing had prepared her for the weight of tradition that seemed to press down on her shoulders like an invisible crown. Queen Victoria, too, sat at the head of the table, her silver hair perfectly arranged, her posture so straight it seemed carved from marble. At 73, she commanded respect, not through words, but through the subtle language of gestures that had been passed down through generations. Her pale blue eyes surveyed the table with the precision of a general reviewing troops, noting every detail, every breach of protocol, every silent message conveyed through the placement of a fork or the angle of a wine glass. Margaret watched in fascination as the Queen's fingers moved with deliberate grace, adjusting her water glass clockwise by exactly 30 degrees. Within moments, the other family members began their own subtle movements. Prince Charles, now 75 and heir to the throne, shifted his bread plate 2 inches to the left. Princess and touched her earring 3 times in succession. Prince Edward, Margaret's fiancé, placed his napkin diagonally across his lap instead of straight. To an outsider, these might have seemed like random gestures, but Margaret was beginning to understand that nothing in this family was ever random. These were the silent signals her etiquette instructor had mentioned, but never fully explained, a secret language developed over centuries, designed to communicate without words in a world where every spoken word could be scrutinized, recorded, and dissected by the press and public. The first course arrived with military precision. 20 uniformed staff members moved like dancers, placing identical plates of Scottish salmon before each diner simultaneously. Margaret noticed how each server waited for a nearly imperceptible nod from the Queen before proceeding to the next movement of their choreographed service. As Margaret lifted her fork, she caught Prince Edward's eye. He gave her the slightest smile, but his fingers tapped twice against his water glass, a signal she didn't understand but somehow knew was important. Her heart raced as she realized she was missing an entire conversation happening right in front of her. The Queen's youngest son, Prince Andrew, sat directly across from Margaret. His reputation for controversy had preceded him, but tonight he seemed subdued, almost withdrawn. Margaret noticed how he kept his hands perfectly still, never reaching for his glass, never adjusting his silverware. His plate remained untouched, the salmon growing cold as he stared at some invisible point beyond the oil painting of King George III. Andrew. The Queen's voice cut through the silence like a crystal bell. The weather has been quite unpredictable lately. On the surface, it was merely small talk about British weather, a safe topic that could fill any uncomfortable pause. But Margaret saw how Andrew's jaw tightened, how his knuckles went white as he gripped his napkin beneath the table. She was witnessing a conversation about something far more serious than rain clouds. "Indeed, Your Majesty," Andrew replied, his voice carefully controlled, "though I believe the forecast shows clearer skies ahead." Margaret glanced around the table, noting how each family member had stopped eating. This wasn't dinner-time conversation. This was a negotiation, a confrontation, a family crisis playing out in code. The Queen's response came not in words, but in the deliberate movement of her wine glass to the center of her place setting. Margaret had no idea what it meant, but she saw how it made Princess close her eyes briefly, how it caused Prince Charles to set down his fork with unusual force, and how it made Edward reach under the table to squeeze her hand in warning. The weight of centuries pressed down on that dining room, carrying the expectations of a nation, the burden of bloodlines, and the crushing responsibility of maintaining an image that could never crack, never show weakness, never reveal the very human struggles happening behind palace walls. Margaret realized that learning to navigate this family wouldn't just require mastering etiquette. It would require understanding pain, disappointment, duty, and sacrifice that ran so deep it couldn't be spoken aloud. These silent signals weren't just about protocol. They were about survival in a world where showing genuine emotion could bring down an institution that had stood for over 1,000 years. As the first course plates were cleared with the same synchronized precision, Margaret caught her reflection in the polished silver centerpiece. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, someone wearing the right clothes and sitting in the right chair, but whose eyes held the dawning realization that she was about to lose herself in a world where silence spoke louder than words, where love was communicated through the angle of a teaspoon, and where the price of belonging might be her own voice. The Queen's fingers moved to her pearl brooch, adjusting it slightly to the left. Margaret didn't know what it meant, but she felt its impact in the sudden stillness that fell over the room, in the way Edward's hand found hers under the table, and in the growing understanding that she was no longer just Margaret. She was about to become part of something much larger and more complicated than she had ever imagined. The second course arrived, and with it came another layer of the silent conversation that would change everything Margaret thought she knew about family, love, and what it truly meant to serve something greater than oneself. 3 weeks after her first formal dinner, Margaret found herself back in the palace dining room. But this time the atmosphere crackled with tension that no amount of royal protocol could mask. Princess Catherine sat to her left, her usual composed demeanor showing hairline cracks that only another woman might notice. The recent tabloid headlines had been particularly vicious, and Margaret could see the toll they were taking on someone she was beginning to consider a friend. The dining room felt different tonight. The same crystal chandelier cast its warm glow. The same portraits of long-dead monarchs looked down from their gilded frames. But there was an electricity in the air that made Margaret's skin prickle with anxiety. She had spent the last 3 weeks studying the family's silent language with the dedication of a scholar, keeping a private notebook where she recorded every gesture, every meaningful glance, every subtle signal she witnessed. Queen Victoria, too, entered the room with her usual regal bearing, but Margaret's trained eye now caught the slight hesitation in her step, the way her fingers worried at her wedding ring, a gesture so small that the casual observer would miss it entirely. Tonight wasn't just about family dinner. Tonight was about crisis management at the highest level. Prince William took his seat across from Catherine, and Margaret immediately noticed the careful distance he maintained. Where a loving husband might have offered a reassuring touch or warm smile, William's face remained a mask of royal neutrality. But his hands told a different story. They moved constantly, adjusting his cufflinks, straightening his tie, tapping a silent rhythm against the table's edge. Margaret recognized the nervous energy of a man caught between his role as heir to the throne and his duty as a protective husband. The appetizers were served with the usual precision, but Margaret noticed how the staff's movements seemed more hurried tonight, how they avoided making eye contact with the family members. Even the servants understood that they were witnesses to something significant unfolding in this ancient ritual of royal dining. Catherine picked up her soup spoon, but instead of beginning to eat, she held it suspended above her bowl for several long moments. Margaret had learned enough of the family's silent language to recognize this as a signal of distress, a way of communicating without words that she was struggling to maintain her composure. The spoon trembled almost imperceptibly before Catherine finally lowered it to her soup. Prince Charles sat at the Queen's right hand, his weathered face bearing the weight of decades of public service and personal scandal. He watched Catherine with grandfatherly concern, his own experiences with media scrutiny clearly informing his understanding of what she was enduring. When he reached for his wine glass, he paused meaningfully, waiting for Catherine to notice before raising it slightly in her direction. A gesture of support that spoke volumes in the family's wordless vocabulary. The Queen's response was swift and decisive. She moved her bread plate 3 inches to the right, a signal Margaret had come to understand meant maintain dignity at all costs. But there was something else in the gesture tonight, a gentleness in the way the Queen's fingers lingered on the plate's edge that suggested maternal concern breaking through centuries of royal reserve. Margaret found herself thinking about her own mother, a warm woman who had raised her children with hugs and spoken encouragement where emotions were shared openly and love was expressed in words and embraces. The contrast with this family, where affection was communicated through the precise placement of silverware and coded conversations about weather, struck her with fresh intensity. Prince Harry, who had been notably quiet since arriving at the palace, suddenly became the center of attention when he did something unprecedented. Instead of following the silent protocols that governed royal dining, he spoke directly to Catherine. "The gardens are particularly beautiful this time of year," he said, his voice carrying an undertone of rebellion that made every family member freeze. "Sometimes it's good to take a walk among the roses, away from the noise of the city." The statement hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Margaret knew enough now to understand that Harry was offering Catherine an escape, suggesting she might want to leave London temporarily to avoid the media storm. But he was also breaking the fundamental rule of royal dining, that serious matters were discussed through signals, not words. The Queen's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. She set down her soup spoon with slightly more force than necessary, creating a soft clink that might as well have been a thunderclap in the silent room. Her pale blue eyes fixed on Harry with the intensity of a laser, and Margaret could feel the temperature in the room drop by several degrees. William's jaw clenched visibly as he struggled with conflicting loyalties, support for his wife, respect for his grandmother, and frustration with his brother's tendency to color outside the lines of royal protocol. His internal battle played out in the rapid succession of signals he sent, touching his temple, adjusting his watch, and, finally, placing both hands flat on the table in a gesture Margaret had learned meant boundaries have been crossed. But it was Catherine who surprised everyone. Instead of acknowledging Harry's offer or following the Queen's lead toward traditional stoicism, she did something that sent shockwaves through the room's carefully maintained order. She smiled. Not the practiced, camera-ready smile she wore in public, but a genuine expression of gratitude that transformed her face and seemed to light up the entire dining room. The smile was accompanied by a gesture Margaret had never seen before. Catherine placed her hand over her heart for just a moment, then extended it slightly toward Harry in what could only be described as a blessing. It was a signal so personal, so outside the traditional royal vocabulary, that it created its own meaning in that moment. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes as she witnessed this moment of raw human connection breaking through centuries of protocol. This wasn't just about royal duty or media management. This was about a family trying to protect and support each other in the only ways they knew how, constrained by traditions that sometimes felt more like prison bars than guidelines. The Queen's response surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of reasserting control through traditional signals, she reached across the table, breaking every rule of proper dining etiquette, and gently touched Catherine's hand. It was such a small gesture, lasting no more than 2 seconds, but it spoke of a grandmother's love for a granddaughter-in-law who had brought new life and joy to an ancient institution. The remainder of the dinner passed in a different kind of silence. Not the tense, coded atmosphere of earlier, but a contemplative quiet where each family member seemed to be processing what had just occurred. They had witnessed tradition bending, perhaps even breaking, in service of something more important, genuine human compassion. As the final course was cleared away, Margaret realized she had been holding her breath for most of the evening. She looked around the table at these complicated, dutiful, deeply human people who had been born into roles that demanded they sacrifice personal desires for public service. And she felt a profound shift in her understanding of what it meant to join this family. The signals would continue, the protocols would be maintained, and the ancient traditions would endure. But underneath it all was something far more powerful than duty or obligation. It was love, expressed in ways that the outside world might never understand, but which sustained a family carrying the weight of a nation's expectations. 6 months had passed since Margaret's first royal dinner, and she now sat at the same mahogany table as a different person entirely. The woman who had once trembled at the sight of multiple forks was now fluent in the family's silent language. But tonight that knowledge felt more like a burden than a gift. She was about to witness the most devastating conversation she had ever seen conducted without words. The occasion was supposed to be celebratory. Prince Edward's birthday dinner, a private family gathering to mark his 45th year. Margaret had spent weeks planning the perfect gift, coordinating with the kitchen staff for his favorite meal, and looking forward to one evening where the family could simply be themselves. She should have known that in this family, nothing was ever simple. King George VII, the Queen's younger brother and Edward's uncle, had returned from his latest rehabilitation stint just 2 days earlier. His struggles with alcohol had been the family's most closely guarded secret for over a decade. But tonight, it was clear that the demons he had been fighting were winning. Margaret could see it in the slight tremor of his hands, the way he avoided eye contact with anyone at the table, and, most tellingly, in how he kept reaching for his water glass only to pull his hand back at the last moment. The Queen sat in her customary position at the head of the table, but Margaret noticed subtle differences in her bearing tonight. Her shoulders were held slightly higher than usual, and she kept glancing toward the door as if expecting, or hoping for, an escape route. Queen Victoria, too, had carried the weight of the monarchy for over 2 decades, but watching her brother's self-destruction was clearly testing even her legendary composure. Prince Edward, usually so confident and charming, seemed to shrink into his chair as the meal progressed. This was supposed to be his night, but the attention of the entire family was focused on the unfolding drama of his uncle's internal struggle. Margaret watched her fiancé's face cycle through emotions: frustration, disappointment, love, and, finally, a resigned acceptance that broke her heart. The first course was served with the usual precision, but Margaret noticed how King George's place setting remained untouched. His soup grew cold as he stared into its depths, as if seeking answers in the cream-colored surface. When the Queen gently tapped her wine glass, a signal Margaret now knew meant, "Please participate." George looked up with eyes so full of pain that Margaret had to look away. Princess, and always the family's most direct member, had positioned herself strategically across from her uncle. Margaret watched as and began what could only be described as a masterclass in royal intervention through silent signals. She started by placing her napkin at precise angles, each position conveying a different message: concern, love, frustration, and, finally, an ultimatum that was as clear as if she had spoken it aloud. The silent conversation that followed was unlike anything Margaret had witnessed before. Anne's napkin movements were answered by the Queen's careful adjustment of her centerpiece flowers. Prince Charles contributed by the methodical rearrangement of his silverware. Each piece moved with deliberate intention. Even young Princess Charlotte, now 16 and attending her first adult family dinner, participated by following her grandmother's lead with the placement of her bread plate. Margaret realized she was watching a family intervention conducted entirely through the language of dining etiquette. Every gesture was calculated to communicate love, concern, and the urgent need for George to seek help before his addiction destroyed not just him, but potentially the reputation of the entire monarchy. The weight of unspoken words filled the dining room until Margaret felt she could hardly breathe. King George understood every signal. Margaret could see it in the way his hands began to shake more noticeably, how his breathing became shallow and rapid. He was a man drowning in plain sight, surrounded by family members who loved him desperately, but were constrained by centuries of tradition that demanded they communicate their deepest fears through the arrangement of dinnerware. The breakthrough came when Prince Edward, perhaps inspired by his cousin Harry's earlier rebellion against protocol, broke the silence with words that would echo in Margaret's memory forever. "Uncle George," Edward said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to do, "I've been thinking about taking a holiday to Scotland. The fresh air might do us both some good. Perhaps you'd join me at Balmoral for a few weeks?" The offer was clearly more than a vacation invitation. Margaret understood that Edward was offering to escort his uncle to the private family retreat where George could receive treatment away from public scrutiny, where he could begin the difficult process of recovery, surrounded by the support of family members who would understand the unique pressures of royal life. The Queen's reaction was swift and emotional. Margaret watched in amazement as the most composed woman she had ever met struggled to maintain her royal bearing, while her eyes filled with tears she couldn't allow herself to shed. The Queen's hand moved to her heart, a gesture so personal and revealing that Margaret felt like she was witnessing something sacred. King George's response came not in words, but in the slow, deliberate movement of his hand toward his nephews across the table. It was a gesture that broke every rule of royal dining protocol. Physical contact during a formal meal was simply not done, but it was also an acceptance of help, an acknowledgement of love, and a promise to fight for his life and the family he had disappointed so many times before. Princess, and tears streaming down her cheeks despite her lifelong training in emotional restraint, reached for her uncle's other hand. Within moments, the entire royal family had abandoned centuries of protocol to create a circle of connection around the man they loved, but had been watching destroy himself in slow motion. Margaret found herself included in this circle of hands, this moment of raw humanity that transcended titles and traditions. She looked around at these extraordinary people who had been taught from birth to carry the weight of a nation's expectations, and she realized that underneath all the pomp and protocol, they were simply a family trying to save one of their own. The formal dinner service continued around them, but something fundamental had shifted in that dining room. The silent signals that had once seemed like elaborate games now revealed themselves as a language developed by people who couldn't afford to show weakness in public, but desperately needed ways to communicate love, fear, hope, and support to each other. As they held hands around that ancient table, Margaret understood that she hadn't just learned to decode the royal family's dining signals. She had been granted access to their hearts. The protocols would continue. The traditions would endure, but tonight had proven that when love demanded it, even the most rigid rules could bend in service of what mattered most. When they finally released hands and returned to their proper positions, Margaret noticed that King George had straightened his shoulders and met each family member's eyes in turn. The silent signals resumed, but now they carried a different message, one of hope, determination, and the kind of love that could sustain a person through their darkest battles. The birthday celebration continued with a quiet dignity that somehow felt more meaningful than any grand gesture could have been. Margaret realized that she had witnessed something that would never appear in any official royal biography, but which would bind this family together in ways that no amount of tradition or protocol ever could. 1 year later, Margaret sat at the head of the smaller family dining table for the first time, no longer as Prince Edward's fiancée, but as his wife of 3 months. The intimate setting held only 12 places instead of the grand table's 24, but the weight of tradition felt just as heavy on her shoulders. Tonight was different, though. Tonight she would learn that sometimes the most important royal signals weren't about protocol at all, but about the courage to break free from expectations that no longer served the people she had come to love. Queen Victoria, too, had been battling pneumonia for 6 weeks, though the public knew nothing about her illness. The official story was that she was taking a well-deserved rest at Windsor Castle, but Margaret knew the truth. The Queen's condition was serious enough that the family had begun having conversations about succession plans that had been theoretical just months before. The woman who had seemed immortal, carved from marble and tradition, was proving to be heartbreakingly human after all. Princess Charlotte, now 17 and poised on the edge of adulthood, had requested this smaller family dinner to discuss her future. Margaret watched the young princess with growing admiration as Charlotte prepared to challenge everything the royal family had expected from their youngest generation. The signals Charlotte was sending weren't the traditional ones Margaret had spent months learning. They were entirely new, created by a young woman who understood that the monarchy would need to evolve or risk becoming irrelevant. Prince William presided over the gathering in his grandmother's absence, but Margaret could see the strain of impending kingship in the tight lines around his eyes. Catherine sat beside him, her own transformation from uncertain newcomer to confident royal complete. But tonight she seemed to be bracing herself for news that would change everything they thought they knew about their daughter's future. The dinner began with Charlotte standing, a breach of protocol so significant that it caused everyone else to freeze mid-motion. In the traditional royal dining room, no one stood until the meal was complete and the highest-ranking family member gave permission to leave. But Charlotte remained on her feet, her chin raised with a determination that reminded Margaret painfully of the Queen in her youth. "I've made a decision about university," Charlotte announced, her voice clear and steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to say. "I've been accepted to Oxford to study international relations, but I've also been accepted to Stanford University in California. I want to spend my junior year in America, and I want to do it without a royal protection detail, without titles, and without the press knowing where I am." The silence that followed was unlike any Margaret had experienced in a year of royal dining. This wasn't the comfortable quiet of people communicating through established signals. This was the stunned silence of tradition being challenged by someone who had the right to challenge it, but had never been expected to exercise that right. Prince William's reaction came first, and it wasn't expressed through the subtle movement of dinnerware or the careful positioning of napkins. His response was purely emotional, a sharp intake of breath followed by the kind of protective instinct that had nothing to do with royal protocol and everything to do with being a father who feared for his child's safety. "Charlotte," he began, but she held up her hand. Another breach of etiquette that would have caused scandal in previous generations, but which somehow felt perfectly natural from this poised young woman who had been raised to think for herself. "I know what you're going to say," Charlotte continued, her voice gentle but unwavering. "You're going to tell me about security risks, about the importance of maintaining the royal image, about duty and tradition and everything that's been drummed into all of us since birth. But I need you to understand something. If I don't have the chance to discover who I am outside of these walls, outside of these expectations, I'll never be able to serve this family or this country with authenticity." Margaret felt her heart break and soar simultaneously as she watched this brave young woman articulate something that Margaret herself had struggled to understand. The royal family's greatest strength, their unwavering commitment to duty, could also become their greatest weakness if it prevented them from growing and changing with the times. Catherine's response surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of supporting her husband's protective instincts, she reached across the table and placed her hand over her daughter's. Not a formal royal signal, but a mother's gesture of understanding and support. "When I married your father," Catherine said quietly, "I thought I understood what it meant to join this family. But I learned that the most important thing isn't following every rule perfectly. It's understanding why the rules exist and knowing when it's time to create new ones." The conversation that followed was unlike any royal family discussion Margaret had ever witnessed. For the first time, they talked openly about the challenges of balancing personal growth with public duty, about the loneliness that came with living under constant scrutiny, and about the courage required to be authentic while representing an institution built on ceremony and tradition. Prince Harry, joining the conversation through video call from his home in California, became an unexpected advocate for Charlotte's plan. His own journey away from traditional royal expectations had been painful for the family, but it had also shown them that there could be different ways to serve while maintaining family bonds. "The monarchy survived my grandmother's modernizations," Harry said, his image flickering slightly on the laptop screen. "It survived my mother's humanitarian work that took her far from traditional royal activities. It will survive Charlotte spending a year learning how the world works outside of palace walls." Margaret watched as the family grappled with fears that had nothing to do with royal protocol and everything to do with loving a young woman who was brave enough to forge her own path. The silent signals she had learned so carefully were replaced by open conversation, tears, laughter, and the kind of honest communication that families needed when facing change that felt both terrifying and inevitable. The breakthrough came when Prince William stood and walked around the table to embrace his daughter, another complete abandonment of formal dining protocol that somehow felt like the most royal thing he could have done. In that moment, Margaret understood that the family's greatest strength wasn't their ability to follow centuries-old traditions, but their capacity to love each other enough to let those traditions evolve. As the evening progressed, Margaret realized she was witnessing the birth of a new chapter in royal history. Charlotte's plan was approved with conditions: security measures that would be invisible but effective, regular family video calls, and a promise to return if her safety was ever compromised. But, more importantly, her courage had opened a door for future generations to balance duty with personal growth in ways that previous royal children had never been allowed to consider. The dinner ended not with the formal procession that usually concluded royal meals, but with the family members lingering around the table, talking freely about hopes and fears that had been hidden beneath layers of protocol for too long. Margaret looked around at these remarkable people who had welcomed her into their complicated, constrained, deeply loving family, and she felt profound gratitude for being present at this moment of transformation. As they finally prepared to leave the dining room, Charlotte made one final gesture that would stay with Margaret forever. The young princess adjusted her water glass clockwise by exactly 30 degrees. The same signal Queen Victoria II had used during Margaret's first dinner to indicate that important business was being conducted. But Charlotte's version of a signal felt different, imbued with hope and possibility rather than the weight of unchanging tradition. Margaret realized that the royal family's silent dining signals would continue to evolve, just as the family itself would evolve. The next generation would create their own vocabulary of love and support, their own ways of communicating across the vast distances that duty sometimes placed between family members. The traditions would endure not because they remained exactly the same, but because they remained flexible enough to serve each new generation's needs. Walking back through the palace corridors beside her husband, Margaret understood that she hadn't just learned to decode the royal family's secret language. She had become part of creating its future. The signals would always matter, but the love they communicated would matter more, adapting and growing as each new member brought their own voice to the ancient conversation between duty and heart that defined what it truly meant to be royal.